Hi, everybody. I think people are still joining on here, but I'm really excited for what's going to turn out to be a fun conversation here today. Welcome to the Globe virtual event on innovation pathways and transition finance towards FutureFit Hydrocarbons. So if you were here for the remedial training on Excel, I think you signed up to the wrong Zoom call, but otherwise we're pretty excited to get going here. My name is Matt Beck. I'm a director with the Delphi Group and also an Energy Futures Lab fellow. And I'm really excited to host this conversation here today. We are hosting this as a follow-on to the Globe Forum 2020 advanced session on energy transformation, where we were exploring the criteria of a future fit hydrocarbon. Hopefully all of those who registered today got an email with the preliminary report on that, and we're hoping to expand on some of those pathways today and what can enable that. So as many of you know, Globe has been working for many decades now on advanced topics of sustainability in business across Canada and beyond. And one of those key pieces in the Canadian context is the energy sector and how to grapple with some of these challenges of energy transition within the Canadian context of being a resource-heavy economy. And we have a unique opportunity here in Canada to lead on these topics and show the world some ways that resource economies can demonstrate how these resources can be used in an economy that has seen broader transition to a lower carbon, more sustainable energy future. And I'm really excited to hear our wonderful panelists today discussing some of the different pathways that can do that and some of the ways we can enable that better. This is a story that Canada can tell the world and differentiate itself before others write a story that maybe we have to react to a bit too much. So before I hand it over to our excellent moderator today, who I will introduce in a moment, a few quick housekeeping matters. So the run of the show is basically going to be a 30 to 40 minute moderated dialogue with conversation from our speakers, but we also want to hear from you. So you'll see two important buttons at the bottom of your screen. You might have to move your mouse if you're in full screen mode to see them. There's a Q&A button and a chat button. So if you've got a question, feel free to use the Q&A button to ask your question. You'll be able to see others and look through the questions that come in. You can upvote them as you see them. We'll be trying our best to answer questions throughout the webinar. So keep them flowing. We'll also do as much work as possible to answer the unanswered questions at the end and follow up with them. So please keep asking the questions even as we're getting close to the end. And the chat, feel free to connect with one another, send notes to everyone or individuals that you know, tell us where you're coming from, share your comments, tips, reactions to the conversation at hand. It is an open forum, so please make sure you're sending your notes to all panelists and other attendees. And if you're having any tech issues, let us know in the chat, send the panelists a note and our tech support team will give you a hand. So I'm gonna pass it over to our moderator in a second, but I'm gonna ask us to all fill out a quick poll. So it should pop up on your screen right now. We got 3 quick questions. We want you to weigh in on what comes to mind when you read the words future fit, what you're most curious about today, and what are the things that you're most interested in taking away from today's session. So while you guys are reading through that and filling it out, I'm going to introduce our moderator, Chad Park, who is the founding director of the Energy Futures Lab and former lead animator, and has recently transitioned to his new role as VP of Sustainability and Citizenship at the Cooperators. Chad is a early member of the Clean 50 Sustainability Hall of Famers out there, and all around great guy, and he's been a tremendous colleague and friend to work with in my own EFL and sustainability journey. So I'm really excited to have him here today. The Energy Futures Lab is a partner in this event today and has done so much work on advancing this topic of FutureFit hydrocarbons. And we will hear a bunch more about that throughout the conversation as well. So Chad, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Great to be here. And I agree, this is a really exciting and important topic. I think it's one of the most important issues facing our country, honestly. And as you said, Matt, the natural resources in our country are key to our economy. At the same time, climate change is a real threat and a risk. And our markets are changing for those natural resources. Citizens are expecting more action on climate change. And now increasingly investors' voices are among the loudest, calling for transparency and action. So there's a lot of talk about building a more resilient economy, especially as we contemplate the build back better kinds of strategies for the post-pandemic period. There's also a lot of talk about transition, and that means a lot of different things to different people. For some even, it's an exciting term, I think, transition. For others, it's a threatening term, especially if it implies that we're transitioning away from the industry that's been the basis of our livelihood and so on. So we'll dive into that a little bit in this discussion. But overall, I think the sentiment here is that there's a need for and an opportunity for more of a Team Canada spirit about these highly complex issues of energy and climate and so on. In general, with the pandemic, there's been a heightened sense of solidarity, I think, and an overall Team Canada spirit about that. And question is, can we transfer that into more of a Team Canada spirit on energy and climate issues, which have otherwise been one of the most divisive issues in the country in recent years? So I think the insights and the speakers that we've assembled here and the dialogue we're about to have will show us that we can do that, and there's a pathway to do it. Addressing climate change and the evolution of our economy is possible, and we're going to explore some of the pathways to do that. And we'll be looking at social and technological innovation that's required, but also emerging concepts in finance that could help enable those innovations. So I'm looking forward to it. To touch on all this, we've got some terrific contributors to the panel, and I'll just introduce them all now. So you can see on the screen, we've got Aaron Romanchuk, the Director of Partnerships from the Energy Futures Lab. We've got Jamie Bonham, Director of Corporate Engagement from NEI Investments. We've got John Zhao, Vice President of Clean Resources at Alberta Innovates, and John Michell, the Vice President of Sustainability from Suncor Energy. So thrilled to have all of these folks to weigh in and to interact together, and we'll move into that in just a moment. Before we do, though, I think we're going to show the results of the poll. Okay, there they are on your screen. So in the first one, it looks like, wow, surprisingly to me anyways, oil is the thing that comes to mind when you hear the word FutureFit, and then otherwise going to the gym. In terms of the concepts that you're most curious about related to that, it's actually a pretty even split: hydrogen, bitumen beyond combustion, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So we will hear about all of those. And what are you most interested in taking away from today's session? So it looks like the top ranked thing is how energy companies are reacting to the concept of FutureFit hydrocarbons. So I think we'll hear in particular from John Michell about that, but I'm sure from everyone. And it looks like everyone's interested in all these things, actually: technology requirements, policy enablers, and investment opportunities. So that's great. Thank you for filling out the poll. And with that, I'm going to start by inviting Aaron Romanchuk from the Energy Futures Lab to kick things off. Over to you, Aaron.
All right. Thank you, Chad, and Matt, for your warm welcome, and thanks to the Delphi Group for co-hosting this panel with the Energy Futures Lab. So just to share a little bit about what the Energy Futures Lab is, for those of you who might not be aware, the EFL is a coalition of innovators and leading organizations who are working together to create the energy system that is fit for the future. It was created in 2015 as a response to the harmful polarization on energy issues. And it now supports a diverse group of 20 partner organizations and over 70 fellows from across the system, the energy system. And they come together over time to find common ground and to take action on collaborative projects that advance solutions for Canada's energy future. So as a microcosm of the bigger system with lots of diversity, the EFL has found that the elephant in the room is usually widely different views about the role of fossil fuels in our future economy. We found common ground around the concept of FutureFit Hydrocarbons, though, in that it is not a yes or a no to hydrocarbons, but more about exploring how these materials are relevant and useful and a continued source of opportunity and prosperity in a low carbon emission future. So we can all acknowledge, I think, that the future is coming at us fast. From international climate agreements to investor preferences, the world is moving forward. In response to this, the lab has been developing initiatives on multiple pathways to create the future energy system. And the future energy system that I'm referring to here, the EFL has a vision for one, and it is grounded in scientific principles and a framework for strategic sustainable development, otherwise known as the Natural Step Framework. And I share this because having that vision that is based on scientific principles makes it not only more robust and rigorous, but very much easier to find common ground on. So one pathway to achieving that vision together is by acknowledging the important role of hydrocarbons in the future energy system. And these are what we refer to as the FutureFit hydrocarbons. By FutureFit, we're referring to using the hydrocarbons in a way that is in line with low carbon emission future. So things like non-combustible uses for bitumen, like creating carbon fiber, and like using hydrogen with carbon capture. FutureFit hydrocarbons really are not just about justification of the status quo. They're about not closing off opportunities and act as more of an aspiration for what's possible. So we, in the Energy Futures Lab, take a backcasting approach from that compelling vision, and that allows us to think beyond the confines of what has been possible historically. This is the approach of the EFL so that we can be more innovative and think of new ways of doing things together. So FutureFit hydrocarbons play a role in getting us to that vision alongside other pathways. We have multiple pathways identified as a part of the Energy Futures Lab, things like e-mobility and artificial intelligence to address the challenges that energy and power industries are facing with an energy transition. And it is very important to note that challenges in an energy transition are not only technical, but social as well. Things like cultural and political barriers exist to the adoption of technology. And the EFL is a social innovation lab that works on identifying solutions to those social barriers so that the technology can be successfully adopted. I'm going to end my comments today by acknowledging that the development and export of oil and gas has helped create a prosperous industrial sector and economy for Alberta and Canada. That is definitely not in doubt. However, we cannot expect that prosperity today lies in the same path that it was in the past, nor can we abandon the resources and assets that have made us prosperous to this point. So now our prosperity challenge lies in developing and leveraging our resources and assets in a way that helps build the energy system the future requires of us. Basically the EFL's mission. So thank you. I'll pass it back to our moderator. I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. And it's good toward the end of your comments there, you actually got into responding to one of the early questions that's posted in the chat box about what are FutureFit hydrocarbons. I know John Zhao, who's coming next from Alberta Innovates, is going to elaborate on that a little bit. But just before I go to John, you mentioned, Aaron, social innovation, and I'm wondering if you can elaborate on what that means a little bit, because it's not necessarily a familiar term to everyone. and in particular, how it relates to technology.
Sure. Yeah. So I've been thinking about this a little bit and how to really have this point hit home around the importance of social innovation. And I'm going to steal and borrow an example that I've heard just this week on a different podcast webinar with Peter Terzakian, who gave the example of the light bulb. So the light bulb, a technology, was invented in 1880, but not widely adopted for 25 years. And this is the light bulb. Like, how much utility is in that? And it wasn't adopted mostly because the social factors weren't in place. The system wasn't ready for it for all sorts of reasons, competitive, education around it. And I think that that's really exemplary, I suppose, of how social innovation can support a technology to get adopted. It's about investments, it's about the right policies, and all of those are social factors that must be in line for the adoption of a technology. And that's the role of social innovation to support technological innovation.
Okay, thanks, Erin. That's a great example, I think, to color that idea a little bit more. Now, having explored that, we're actually going to do more of a deep dive into the technology and the potential here in terms of innovation pathways. And there are a few experts in the country who can say more about that than John Zhao. So I'm happy to turn now to you, John, to say a few opening words as well.
Well, thank you, Chad, and thank you, Matt, for the invitation. It's really to be honored to be with a panelist at this event. So what are the future fitting hydrocarbons, and what are the innovation pathways to get us to the net zero future? As Aaron alluded already, future fitting hydrocarbons needed to be low emission, certainly, from production to consumption, but also needed to produce the goods that the society or consumers desire, right? In terms of GHG emission from hydrocarbon-based transportation fuels, for instance, it should be noted that there are two types of emissions, so I should differentiate. The one is the emissions related to the production of the fuel, such as gasoline and diesel. And there are another type of emissions from actually the consumption or combustion of the fuel. For Alberta, GHG emission from oil and gas production is significant. The upstream oil sand industry itself emits over 70 million tons of CO2 per year. The oil sand industry certainly has made significant progress in GHG emission reduction, and our industry is the best in terms of ESG performance in the world. That is environment, social, and governance. More importantly, I think the technologies and innovation being developed and deployed put the industry on the pathways to net zero in bitumen production, actually. I can highlight three sets of the technologies. The first is energy efficiency. Lots of those technology actually is in place already, include the cogen, efficient water treatment, and waste heat recovery. The second one is certainly a solvent-based technology using solvent to partially or completely displace the steam in situ recovery and in or hot water in surface mining. These technologies have the potential to reduce direct emission, direct emission by up to 90%. And the third one is the carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or CCUS. Alberta is a global leader in CCUS. The Quest project itself has stored more than 5 million tons of CO2 already. Recently commissioned Alberta carbon trunk line will put Alberta on another level. So together, these three sets of technologies can put upstream industry on the pathways to near zero emissions, probably not quite zero, but near zero emissions. However, on life cycle basis, fuel production, which includes the upstream production, only accounts for 20% of the GHG emission. So the other 80% is actually coming from the combustion of the fuel, you know, at the consumer side, right, in your vehicle. So therefore, future-fitting hydrocarbons must address emission from the combustion side. For Alberta and Canada, bitumen beyond combustion, or BBC, and the blue hydrogen certainly represented two important opportunities. In BBC, part of the bitumen is diverted from combustion, away from combustion, but converted into value-added materials such as carbon fiber, activated carbon, and ash photo binder. Alberta Innovates, as Chad mentioned, has been leading the BBC effort, and our research indicates that significant market potential for these products. Chemically, actually, bitumen and its heaviest components, ash 14, may have significant advantage over the conventional light oil in making BBC product. Significant progress actually has been made in BBC in the last few years. In blue hydrogen, natural gas is used to make hydrogen through steam reforming, and the byproduct of CO2 is captured and sequestered. So this hydrogen actually has near zero GHG footprint. Alberta actually knows how to do this. We have a large scale project in this side already. You know, on the steam reforming side and on the CO2 sequestration and storage side. So many of you also know probably Transition Accelerator has been leading the effort in blue hydrogen. So hydrocarbons for BBC and the blue hydrogen would be certainly future fitting. Number one, they are low emission. And number two, they lead to consumer desired product and have a potential to create significant values for Alberta. In addition, I should also say small modular nuclear reactors could be a good fit for Alberta in long term. SMR can provide zero emission heat and power for upstream production, but it can also provide the power required for BBC manufacturing process as well. So in summary, here are a few pathways. In upstream, the most practical and probably effective pathways will be through a combination of CCUS, solvent, and energy efficiency. In combustion side or consumption side, BBC and blue hydrogen certainly are promising pathways. In long term, SMR could used for both upstream production and non-combustion manufacturing. I should note that all the technologies mentioned above will require further development to improve efficiency and reduce costs. In particular, BBC is still at the early stage of the development. Significant public and private investment will be required to make this vision into a reality. We do believe BBC is a critical pathway for Alberta in obtaining its global share in the future-fitting hydrocarbon. So with that, I will turn this back to Chad.
Okay, thanks, John. That's great. For me, what I love about those examples and those pathways is the opportunity to show how this industry, for example, can be part of the solution, not just part of the problem as it sometimes gets painted. And in particular, BBC, bitumen beyond combustion, because it turns what is a liability of the resource, its carbon intensity, from a liability into an asset, something that is the basis of opportunity. So that's exciting. I think I'm going to ask you one question before I turn to John Michell, and it's about the the timeframes. You kind of alluded a little bit at the end, but of course, everyone following climate change science and so on is, has a very heightened sense of the urgency to deal with these issues. So I'm just wondering if you can say a little bit about that range of technologies you just laid out. You don't have to go into each one, but how soon can they become impactful, let's say, in the marketplace in terms of emissions reductions and so on?
So right now we are, Chad, right now we are looking at the three major opportunities, right? Carbon fiber, activated carbon, and ash photo binder. So among those three, I would say carbon fiber probably has the greatest potential, but also at the earliest stage of the development, right? So that for that to happen, I think it will be probably in 5 to 10 years of time. I know the timeline is still very aggressive. Even my colleagues probably caution me, don't be that daring, but I think what happens in the last few months is really highlighting this we have to accelerate this development, right? For the other two opportunities, actually, activated carbon, currently we have one actually local spin-off from University of Alberta is constructing or in the process of putting the first demonstration plant together. And that production line actually can duplicate it or replicate it over and over again once it's approved. So we can see actually, in 3 to 5 years, they have a commercial production, right? And we also have a few companies pursuing ash photo binder, included Dr. Ian Gates and his spin-off company, Ceridium. And those technologies are also getting into field testing. We're working with him right now on 1,000 barrel a day field demonstration. So that technology or opportunity can move forward as quickly as well.
Okay, thanks, John. That's great. I see that there are already great questions being put in the chat box. So I'll just encourage people to have a look there, and I will bring forward some of these questions in a moment. We were going to encourage you to do the questions in the Q&A portion. So if you do that, that's okay too, then people can upvote them, but it seems like it's everyone's natural instinct to put them in the chat, and that's fine too. I'll track both of them for when we get to the Q&A portion. Just building from John, I'm going to turn to the other John. Even in the opening poll there, it's clear that people are curious about how individual companies are responding to all this. And I think it's helpful to hear from John about Suncor in particular and the industry more generally, what's their view on some of these opportunity areas. So John Michell, over to you.
Here we go. I think I'm good there now. And so, first of all, thanks Chad, and thanks everyone else. It's hard to do these panels and not to have the benefit of being in the room with all of these familiar faces and people who I respect so much. And so, good to see at least virtually. I think where we're coming from, most I think know Suncor, Canada's largest integrated energy company, and we're in a bit of a unique vantage point because we play in just about all aspects of the energy system in Canada, whether that's production associated with oil sands, whether it's power production both on the natural gas and renewables side, whether that's biofuel production, whether that's investments in new technology, whether it's investments in our retail stations and EV charging. We're in all parts of the energy system, which gives us a really neat vantage point to understand how the transition can work and how we might be able to lead through that transition. And that's really where we come from, is that we're really quite optimistic that Canada's energy companies, Suncor in particular, can play a real leadership role in the energy system transformation. And so when we're thinking about that, I want to talk a little bit about how we approach innovation, but there's a couple of different things that are important to us. Firstly, there's probably 4 different components that we're thinking about. First of all, what is it that we can do to materially improve the cost and carbon performance of the base business? And so John talked a lot about some of those technologies that we're looking at to do that, and to really set up that solid foundation of what has provided some of the cash flow and provided some of our ability to invest in some of these other alternatives. Make sure we've got a really solid foundation that is improving its carbon productivity associated with our base business. So critical foundation that we need. Then what we start thinking about is, okay, what are the low carbon profitability opportunities that we've got? Where can we invest in a new technology? Where can we create a new partnership where we can grow these technologies into profitable lines of business or to augment our existing lines of business? And so that's really the category number 2. And then third is, how do we use our connection with the customer to help raise the profile of emissions performance and reducing emissions? So when you think about it, we've got, at least pre-COVID, we were engaging with millions of Canadians a day through the Petro-Canada stations that we have. And so what can we do there to help those customers tackle their own emissions? That can be things like offering fast charging electric vehicle charging opportunities, which we put in across the country. So there's lots of ways we're thinking about how do we increase that consumer connectivity that we can play a role in. And then lastly, what does transformation leadership look like? So what's the portfolio of opportunities we're trying to grow, early stage investments, early stage technologies, and how do we create the right policy environment to lead through that transformation? So those are kind of the 4 ways we think about it. And then when we move into what does that mean for innovation and what does that mean for accelerating the clean technology in the country, there's a couple of really interesting shifts that are going on and have been going on for quite a number of years, but I think are really instrumental in how we lead through the transition. And the first is this shift that's going on within the energy sector from a very internal look on how we innovate, is, looking at these challenges, looking at these problems as these are our issues, these are our challenges, and only we know how to solve them, to a real shift to externalizing those and a more open innovation model where we're actually saying, you know what, we need the brightest and best minds across the country and across the world to help us solve these problems. And so you really see that shift into this more open innovation model, and you see that through things like Canada's Oil Sands Innovation Alliance, through the Clean Resources Innovation Network, even areas where we've invested into almost an early stage development space like Evoke. You've got things like the Carbon X Prize, where we're trying to figure out how to crack the nut on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And then you've got the social innovation that Aaron talked about and Chad that you're familiar with on EFL and the Energy Futures Lab. And what does that look like? How do we rethink where we're going? So we've got this real shift in collaboration as the first thing that's important in the innovation space. And then the second one is how can the oil and gas industry be a real driver in the adoption and acceleration of clean technology? And so we can play the oil sands is it's in a unique position to be one of the biggest markets for clean technology, and John talked about a lot of the different ways we can do that, but also one of the bigger investors in clean technology. And what would we do in order to accelerate those transformation technologies really rapidly? And there's kind of 3 important parts to that. What are the new partnerships we can create? What are the new business models we can deploy? And what are the new financing methods that we can use? And a recent example for us was an investment we made in LanzaJet, or with LanzaTech and with Mitsui and an airline and Suncor to create LanzaJet, which is a sustainable aviation fuel producer. We see that as a promising market, but it's an interesting, so we've got a really interesting organization and an interesting partnership that's been created there. And then we've got a really interesting business model that gets created. And this is one where we've used in the past, where we'll take an equity position into a new technology that we think has potential. And then we can take some of our operating personnel who have expertise in the scaling and running of some of these commercial facilities and second them into that. We did that with Enerchem in the past. We're looking at doing that with LanzaJet in the future. And really combining the skill sets of the entrepreneur and the technology developer with the skills and expertise that the oil and gas sector can bring to the scaling and running of those commercial facilities. Really interesting model there. And then lastly, the interesting financing approach to that one, which is an initial investment, but LanzaJet doesn't have to go every time if they hit their economic, environmental, and business targets, then there's a cash call on the investors so that they don't have to keep going back to market to raise further capital. There's a cash call that we've already committed to if they hit those milestones. So it actually has the potential to accelerate that deployment of the technology and growth of that commercial enterprise even faster. So maybe I'll leave it there, Chad, but that's a bit of a snapshot into how we're looking at playing in this space and how I think the energy sector and Suncor specifically can help lead through the transition.
Okay, thanks, John. That's great. And in a moment, we're going to hear a little bit more about the finance world and the investor perspective from Jamie Bonham. I want to ask you one question too, John. I'm using the moderator's opportunity here. We've heard even in recent weeks a fair bit out of Suncor specifically about some of these opportunity areas and investments. It's not the usual broader story we hear out of the energy sector. Let's just say it that way in the public dialogue. So can you just paint the picture of, the industry overall? How exceptional is Suncor in this, I guess? And there's some questions that are coming that we'll get into later, about sort of how high a priority is this for the industry, for example, and, and is that changing? So you want to just react to that, and we can set up for a later conversation in the Q&A as well.
Sure. I mean, there's lots of diversity within the sector, and I did allude to the collaboration that's going on and growing, and that's, you see that across the sector. There's a realization that the future is changing and is going to be different, and we need to prepare for that. And different companies will react in different ways. So when I think about Suncor specifically, we've always kind of had to preserve some optionality within a number of these different things and tested and been an early investor in a number of these. You can go right back to our early investments in the expansion of the wind industry in Alberta as an example. But it's also there. The reason why I've got a lot of hope for the future is there is a real innovative spirit. There is an entrepreneurial culture, and there is a willingness to take risk. And I see that's what you're seeing in some of the investments in some of these low carbon opportunities that we're looking to explore. Is let's see if we can make this work. How can we bring our skills and talents to bear on that? Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't also say that our ability to do that is contingent upon the success of the business that's got us here. So in order to transform and in order to make these investments, we have to make sure that what generates our cash and that our foundation is really strong. So this is not about walking away from what's got us to where we are today, but reinforcing that foundation and making sure that can be both cost efficient in the future, but also drive down the carbon performance of that sector to continue to drive some of that profitability that will allow us to make some of these investments and dip our toe into some of these opportunities that we see unfolding.
Okay. Thanks, John. I suspect we might have more questions around this whole topic, and it's great to get your insights on that. So a few times it's been alluded to the role of investors in all this, so happy to now turn the floor over here to Jamie Bonham from NEI Investments and share some perspective from why investors are tracking all of this and why it's interesting and how they're approaching it, especially an investor that's interested in engagement like NEI is. So go ahead, Jamie.
Sure, sounds great. And my apologies if you hear some rolling thunder. If anyone had any questions as to, is it a good idea to give a 6-year-old a rolling office chair if you have hardwood floors? The answer is definitive no. But yes, so this is, investors these days are under enormous pressure to align their portfolios with the energy transition, and that's only growing every day. we're facing some fundamental questions about how to do that. Right? Is it through immediately shifting capital to sectors and companies that you feel are likely to be resilient, and thus away from sectors that look less likely? This is what's driving a lot of the divestment movement. Or is it through supporting the companies you currently own to evolve and adapt and become resilient in a low carbon future? And I think a lot of investors, and myself included, are straddling both those realities. And so the ideas that we're talking about today and the ability of sustainable finance to drive innovation and transformation of the energy system at scale should be of the utmost interest to those kinds of investors. And so that brings us to sustainable finance, and I'm going to be brutally efficient with describing it, so my apologies about shortening it. But in essence, we're talking about sustainable finance that has, it's finance that has the intention of creating this sort of future world that we want to find, right? This low carbon future. And while it is not the exact same as ESG investing and sustainable finance, they are intertwined, right? You have to know one to understand where the other came from. So people are probably already familiar with the rapid rise in popularity of ESG investing. For context, the UN Principles for Responsible Investment have some 2,500 signatories representing 85 trillion with a T, US trillion even, in assets under management. And so there's definitely a whole lot of disparity in how all those investors are living up to those principles. I'm not saying that everyone has seen the light by any means, but what all those investors share is that same growing pressure to be accountable, right? To be accountable to this future. And this leads me to maybe one of the first forays into taxonomies to create sustainable finance. That's the EU. So the EU taxonomy and sustainable finance was in part created as an accountability mechanism for the financial industry claims around ESG, essentially trying to stamp out greenwashing by defining what is and what isn't sustainable. And this is the taxonomy that has spurred the current opportunity for transition finance in Canada. So the EU taxonomy is very detailed. It was a very complex process. It gets really into the nitty gritty of what is and isn't sustainable. It was passed into law, I think just last week, and it's grown in its actual mandate. It's not just about stamping out greenwashing now. It is really a fundamental plank in how the EU sees itself meeting its goal of a net zero economy by 2050. One thing that you will not find in this taxonomy is the oil and gas sector. So it is explicitly excluded as being a viable part of the sustainable finance. Obviously, that's a challenge for Canada's economy. And so the response from Canada, federal government put together this expert panel on sustainable finance that had an explicit mandate to look at sustainable finance through the lens of our resource-based economy. And so what they came up with was a roadmap for turning sustainable finance into just finance, right? So basically, how do we use the mainstream levers of our finance industry to drive the transition? One of those recommendations that came out of the panel was to create a transition taxonomy for specific to the Canadian economy. And so that recommendation that has been taken up, is a number of players, major banks and insurers are behind creating this multi-stakeholder process to create a transition economy under the auspices of the Canadian Standards Association. And they are close to coming up with what I'll call a first draft of this taxonomy. And so the opportunity that's in front of us is that we have that massive pool of capital that I referred to that's looking for tangible ways to live up to its ESG commitments. We can use the transition finance opportunities such as FutureFit Hydrocarbons to meet those needs. And again, we're not talking about angel investors. We're not talking about venture capital, which are extremely important pieces of the ecosystem. We are talking about trillions of dollars that are looking for a credible pathway to the energy transition. And I think sustainable finance has two compelling value propositions for those investors. So one, it helps you to build a resilient portfolio through the purchase of sustainable finance products, think transition bonds, for example. And the second part is that the role that transition finance can play in making the companies in our portfolios resilient. And so the energy sector is a great example of that, and drive them towards a place of being resilient in a low carbon future. So in closing, the upcoming release of the CSA, so Canadian Standards Association taxonomy, which is, I'll say, imminent. It's sometime this summer. It represents an opportunity to use some of these concepts that we've been talking about in terms of blue hydrogen, in terms of bitumen beyond combustion, and test drive how to use transition finance and to develop a market appetite for it. And I think it's we should all be paying attention to when this comes out and grab this opportunity which is in front of us, which I think is huge, and a chance to really be innovative. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. That was a great, quick, efficient tour of sustainable finance. Nicely
I don't talk
done.
that fast normally, so there you go.
I'm going to just jump right into the Q&A because there's lots of good questions that are showing up in the chat box. And I'm actually going to start with one that is, speaking of someone earlier, I think it was Aaron talked about the elephant in the room. Let's just jump right into one that is sort of along those lines. And it does, I think, maybe first go to John Michell, I'm going to say, and maybe Jamie has some views on this too, or others. It says, if oil and gas companies are so interested in reducing emissions and investing in FutureFit hydrocarbons, why is the vast majority of their capital expenditures going to new exploration and production at the same time that they're shelving investments in projects and technologies that reduce emissions? So that's a pretty challenging question, and a good one, and probably a common one, I would think. And so let's hear, John, the sort of company perspective on that, but also Jamie, investor perspective in the sense that, is this new emerging transition thing really an opportunity? Like, are investors really going to put some dollars into this? Yeah, that kind of thing. So, John.
Sure, and I do like the elephant in the room analogy, and I particularly like the fact that Erin actually has an elephant in her room. Yeah. And so there are lots of commentary they're trying to paint a picture of a selective reduction in capital focused on things that people perceive as not being as important to those organizations as others, and including some of the low carbon investments. What the picture looks like is actually a massive capital operating cost and dividend reduction, quite frankly, across all parts of the oil and gas sector through COVID and with the price war. So it is not a selective reduction on those, and I can speak to that very specifically for Suncor. We have 2 exciting projects that are sanctioned and that we're having to delay as a result of the capital constraints, and it highlights the need for a robust cash flow and robust business and successful business and resilient business in order to make those investments. So the way I respond to that is capital has come down across the board. It has come down on exploration, it has come down on capital projects in the base business, it's come down on capital projects in low carbon ventures. It has come down in terms of the operating and sustaining capital that we have. And our investors are also seeing that as well with some of the reductions in the dividends. So it is not a sign of a lack of commitment to those initiatives, but rather a indication of the times that we're in with the current market conditions through COVID and what's going on between the Saudis and or between OPEC and Russia.
Okay, thanks, John. There's a follow-up here. I'm still going to turn to Jamie on that one, so I hope you're getting ready, Jamie. But I would say a related question from Michael. It talks about the oil and gas sector being at great risk, and in a few different ways, and sort of how do we reconcile the need to invest in these things with the substantial economic realities. So I guess I would just say, maybe John, a quick follow-up to you before we go to Jamie. Would you agree there's a great risk there? And do you think, I'm gonna guess you think Suncor is responding well to that risk, but do you think the industry overall is addressing the risk as as much as it should?
Well, I do. I think there's a visibility of that risk that we've never had before, and so you look at, I get the question a fair bit around, has commitment waned or not waned? And if you look at what actually has happened through the course of the last number of months, you've seen a lot of continued commitment to the type of ambition that the sector has around the future and a low carbon future and how to participate in it. And you've also seen a real effort and strong push to say, how do we use the recovery to improve and change the kind of investment picture that we have for some of the opportunities that we want to create. And so when we're looking at our own picture, yeah, we're looking at how do we want to invest in the base business to keep it robust, and how do we want to generate the returns and bring those projects forward that we can invest in from a low carbon perspective as well. The two projects that we've shelved briefly are our cogen at Base Plant and the 40 Mile Wind project. We're looking at those are delayed for a period of time, and we're looking at, okay, how do we bring those back into the mix, and what does that look like as we investigate our capital portfolio in its entirety.
Okay, thanks, John. Hopefully Jamie's now had enough time to prepare his answer as well.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think it is a good question. And there's, I mean, if you want to, I mean, just to speak, you know, right to the elephant in the room, is that I mean, I really don't think all the companies are going to make it, right? Like, not everyone is actually built for this transition. And I think that's just a fact. Like, just the way, there's a very different approach that different companies have. And so you can't treat all the companies as the same, I'd say, is the first thing I would go to. I think some of what we're seeing right now in terms of what those priorities are, there's a couple things I'd say to that. I mean, one is just what we've seen right now around the CapEx and pulling that back. In many ways, it is kind of understandable. These are some projects with very high upfront costs and a longer term payout. And so it's not surprising that those are delayed a bit in this environment. Really, we are, I mean, investors like myself are definitely still asking those questions to ensure there is that commitment still going forward. And I think we do see that. That's the response we're getting. But in terms of that sort of prioritization and whether there's a balance, I think the real challenge there is around the investor base, right? Are they actually ready for a rapid transformation, or a transformation at all, really, right? You have analysts who've been valuing these companies as oil and gas producers for ages, and there's a certain way you look at a company and a certain way you value it. I see part of the challenge here is making sure that the investor base itself is on board with this idea of building resilience and creating a transformative energy company that will fit into a low carbon future. And I think once you get there, you can have that longer term support that enables you to move faster, right? Because right now you are being rewarded by the market for those short-term traditional like spending on E&P kind of activities, right? So I think a lot of it comes back to the investor.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. I've got time for one more question, I think, before I have to turn it back to Matt Beck. So I'm gonna choose the one that Richard Adamson has posed toward the start, and I'm gonna turn to first John Zhao and then to Aaron. It's a question about approaching this challenge by pursuing industrial carbon management systems as opposed to individual technologies and projects. And he goes on to elaborate a little bit there. So John, even though we asked you to talk about some of the individual technologies, can you respond to that question from Richard about systems? And then I'd like to hear Aaron's perspective on that as well.
Maybe go to the next question, because I have not found Richard's question yet. Let me read that question first. Sorry about that.
Okay.
I tried to reply some of the questions online.
Yeah,
so
I saw that you're responding to some of the technical questions, which
yeah,
we're grateful for you for doing that. Thank you.
Yeah.
So Aaron, do you feel ready? And then we can come back to John on just sort of responding to this question about the need to take a systems approach as opposed to just one technology at a time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the Energy Futures Lab is consistently putting the issue at the center. So, the issue, being able to do that and look at and challenge or an opportunity from the systems level opens up a lot of more possibilities, and you can approach it more, I would say, strategically, looking at it at that level. So we focus a lot on one example that I've used recently is our approach to lithium and growing the lithium industry in Alberta, where we've looked at lithium as the opportunity to sort of use our existing skill set and apply it to something that's going to be more fit for the future. And by bringing it up to that systems level, we not only foster collaboration, but we really have a larger, I guess, impact on what that market can look like, and then avoid sort of like the blind alleys, or avoid, doing harm to another system, and all of those benefits of the systems level perspective bring.
Great, thanks, Aaron.
So Chad, I'm ready.
Okay, go for it, John.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Certainly, to the extent we can and we should, looking at the system approach, right? So the example there is certainly great. You capture the CO2, you use for that CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. That is a great example. But we also should be a bit more realistic in terms of what a particular technology can do. For instance, carbon utilization, other than CO2 enhanced oil recovery. In terms of scale, the volume, I think we need to take all those into consideration. So what I try to do in my sort of opening remark is really focused on those technology, at least on the upstream side, focused on what is most realistic, right? So certainly it's a great point.
Okay, thanks, John. I promised Matt I would wrap this part up at 5:02, and that's where we're at. So I think with that, I'm just going to acknowledge that there are obviously more questions than we've had time to dig into here, and I think there's some really good questions that are both broad and specific here. And I know I think Matt's going to allude to the fact that Globe has a commitment to try to follow up even on the unanswered questions as well. So I just want to thank the panelists for your dialogue and your interventions here and your responses, and for sort of painting the picture, giving your perspective. And I'll turn it back over to Matt to wrap us up.
Thanks, Chad. Yeah, great conversation today. Thank you to all of our panelists for your insight and frank assessment of where we're at and the areas where we need to improve. And thank you for our attendees who asked such great questions. I really love the conversation around the bigger picture and the systems implications of all this, and this kind of long-term project that we're talking about while still facing these very short-term challenges at the same time. And, to me, this underscores how important it is to have these kinds of conversations and to continue coming together across, whether it's upstream, downstream, end use, technology developers, financiers, and producers, and everything in between, community members who care about the land that these things happen on. This is a big problem that's complex with lots of different aspects to it and individual challenges. And if we can't work together on it, we're not going to succeed. So I think that, to me, is what I take away here, is in order to write this new story about how we can use these resources in a way that is aligned with doing no harm to our environment and our society and leaving everybody in a better place than they started, at the same time ensuring that we can thrive on this planet, in this country, forever, is really what we're getting at here. And it takes a lot of work, and I'm excited to join you guys in doing that. We're going to share a recording of this in follow-up email. We'll also add some key speaker takeaways and resources that have been mentioned, and do our best to answer some of the unanswered questions from the chat and the Q&A in an email shortly. And I also want to remind you, we have a few additional events coming up. Our next Globe virtual event is the Clean Tech Connect Key Learnings and Advice from Young Founders in partnership with Leading Change Canada. And that'll be on Thursday, July 9th from 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And after that, we're going to have a conversation with Minister Catherine McKenna and Michael Sabia on Thursday, July 16th at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. Also, take a look at the Energy Futures Lab's latest Big Ideas for Our Energy Future series with events throughout the summer on July 14th, July 28th, August 11th. And keep your eyes out for updates by email on additional events beyond these ones. As always, feel free to join the conversation. We've got a bunch of socials on the screen there. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks so much, everybody.